So before I get into the slides, since we're going to be a little more extemporaneous here, how many of you here in the room are really focused on, a singular project, or how many of the folks in here are focused on content? How many of you here are focused on ecosystem and platform? How many of you in here are focused on social? Okay. So it's an interesting cross-section. One of the cool things about what we've been working on, so at IDG, we started off focused on all the old school aspects of the games industry, console, where we still work with all the top 20 console publishers. But we're also now working with the Tencents of the world, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Oculuses, Amazon, et cetera. So one of the cool things about my job is that we're learning a significant we're learning so much each and every day about all the new areas within the games market. And one of the nice things about that is we're not only learning about the best practices, but we're also learning about some of the risk factors. So what's interesting in our research practice in working with clients is that we can not only help them with how to do things and what's working, but also what's not, so they can avoid repeating the mistakes of some of our other clients. Another thing to add is that we're looking at VR, AR, MR. We're also looking at esports. We're looking at PC, console, mobile. We're looking at the expansion of different business models. And all of those things, in sort of confluencing together, it leads to this much more complex ecosystem. So even though we're helping to educate the market, we're also learning from all of the key stakeholders along the way as well. Maybe what we could do is, while this deck is loading, I'm not really sure what's going on. It's going?
Just to say, yeah.
Okay, cool.
We're going to be any second.
All right.
Thank you for helping out for a minute.
Yeah, no sweat, no sweat. Before I get into it, let's reverse engineer this for a second. Does anybody have any questions off the top? Any top of mind questions about the market, in terms of segmentation, trends, things that you guys are seeing or want to talk about that are top of mind for you? Yes?
When do you see hitting critical mass in VR?
I think we're probably 2 to 3 years away. There's sort of this weird disconnect. All right. Let me answer Mike's question real quick. I think we're at this interesting disconnect because there are a lot of investors in VR. Some of that is smart money, or folks that have historically been very wise in their investment strategy. But there's also a lot of fast money going in that's more opportunistic. And so what I worry about is that a lot of these investors who are putting money into this ecosystem are not going to be patient enough to see it come to fruition. So just based on what we're seeing in the market, both in the West and in Asia, we're probably 2 to 3 years away. Part of it is the content. We're not at the critical mass there, and also on the price point side when it comes to hardware, but we're about to talk more about that as well. So just some very quick context, and I've already touched on some of it. Before I got to IDG, I was an investor, and we worked with Chinese and Western companies in games and on internet. And ever since then, we've been sort of bringing in other folks with market research, analytics, business intelligence, forecasting, and strategic consulting skill sets. And so you'll recognize a lot of the logos here. A lot of the more traditional games stakeholders from earlier years, and we work with all the major publishers, and we even work with all of the major brick and mortar retailers across the North American and European landscapes. But over the last 5 years, we've been able to increase our client base by fourfold, from 20 clients to 91 clients across 40 countries. And the reason why we've been able to expand so significantly is because gaming itself has become so much more ubiquitous. So yes, maybe one day we're working on a big project for Google or Facebook or Tencent, and the next day we're working on some strategic advisory for Psyonix on how to do cross-platform multiplayer for Rocket League. And then the next day we might be working with some of the investment firms in being a strategic advisor there in helping them with M&A and investment due diligence. So with that being said, We work with basically every type of company in every phase of growth within the market, whether it's major media strategics, big corporates, major publishers, as well as indies and startups across PC, mobile, console, VR, AR, MR. So getting right into the data now, let's start macro, and then we're going to drill down. First things we see in the market today for the games industry at large, there are a few key trends that we see from an analyst perspective. The first is that there's a lot of cross-pollination, and Agatha actually referenced that a little bit, even just within the VR circle of things, VR, AR, MR, and what that could mean for advertisers and content creators going forward. What we're seeing here in the market is a blurring of the lines across all of these key areas. So it's no longer physical versus digital, or console versus PC, or Microsoft versus Sony, or China versus the US, or freemium versus buy-to-play. What we're seeing now are a lot of hybrid business models, content trends, gameplay trends, distribution patterns. You might see GameStop now being one of the biggest sellers of season pass on DLC. We might also see business model hybridization where a subscription-based MMO then becomes a free-to-play MMO 2 or 3 years down the line to monetize at the lower end of the funnel. We might see on geography now, NetEase is a company that we've been doing work with in China, but here in the States, on Miyoji, which had almost zero localization for the West, was a top 10 grossing app, at least initially in its launch months here in the West. So we're seeing a lot of interesting things, but for VR, what's really interesting is we're already seeing a lot of interesting tie-ups. So whether it's Sony getting involved relative to Microsoft on AR and MR, and then of course with Oculus or with HTC Vive, and even some of the mobile VR guys like Google and Samsung. And with that being said, we're seeing more gameplay mechanics and features that are sort of leading that revolution. When we talk to all of the major platform holders about VR, AR, and MR, what they tell us is, we hope the gaming will be that killer app, and that ads can kind of work around that ecosystem for 2 reasons. The first is that gaming is by far one of the leading engagement drivers in the market. And that's obviously a huge boon for advertisers because you have captive, engaged eyeballs. But the second reason is that a lot of the folks that we work with across the world tell us that it's the gaming developers that really get this, they really understand the technology, and they're often at the forefront of innovation from a development standpoint. And so for us, we're always trying to work not only with the more established incumbents, but we're always looking for that next big thing, not only to inform our analyst capabilities and understanding the market, but also because for us, it's fun to really work with different teams from conception all the way through to the very end, where hopefully they can reach that pot of gold. And finally, hybridization across different emerging business models. So esports right now is obviously a hot subject, and at some point down the road, when the tech barriers and the economic barriers are alleviated, we'll hopefully see esports on VR, or VR on esports, depending on how you want to term it. And within that, we're also seeing some interesting innovations in branding. So I think one of the big underplayed themes here is just how big gaming has become. If you compare apples to apples against all the other entertainment content verticals out there, gaming is now number 2 in the world, behind television. And it's already over a $100 billion business worldwide through 2016, based on our estimates. And it's growing at around a 9% 5-year CAGR, mobile obviously being the biggest, but there are other facets of that, and VR, AR, and MR are one of the key inflection growth drivers that, in a best case scenario, it can add a significant amount of growth over the next 5 to 10 years. And I know this is a really busy slide here, but this is sort of how we spatially look at the overall market. So obviously there are a lot of logos that are not on here, but we're trying to look at this from a platform and ecosystem perspective, right? So of course, in the middle you have at a base level PC mobile console, but we all know that those paradigms are old frameworks in terms of looking at the market. Beneath that, you see in orange reddish tinge a lot of those major VR platforms or ecosystems, whether it be HTC Vive or Oculus or Samsung Gear VR on mobile or PlayStation VR. And then you, of course, at the bottom have a lot of the retail and digital distribution incumbents. And the irony of this is that the technology is moving in a direction where things should be more seamless and platformless, if you will. But at the same time, because of the business conditions, what we're seeing is there's still not a full sort of open source model in a lot of these platforms. And instead, we've seen a lot of these folks trying to silo the market with more content exclusivity and more of a fragmentation within the user base. So in the West, you might be a gamer or a consumer of entertainment that might need to access his or her content through not one, not two, but maybe 7 or 8 different devices, different ecosystems, different platforms. And it shouldn't be that way, but we think that that trend's just only going to continue over time, which is a challenge and an opportunity for all of the developers at conferences such as these. Now, looking at VR at that hardware level, you have a few different tiers, right? Obviously, you have lowest end mobile VR with Google Cardboard, deluxe mobile VR. At the upper end of the range, of course, you have console-based VR and PC-based VR. Smack dab in the middle is what people are calling all-in-one VR, which is a much bigger use case in China right now. You have certain hardware pieces like the Baofeng suite of products where the idea is there isn't a PC or a console rig to power the headset. There's still a lot left to be desired there from a production value and latency standpoint. But what we're already seeing in this market at a hardware level is just how fragmented not only the market is, but the user base is. So how do you appeal to all of these different demographics with different form factors, different levels of production value, different levels of graphical fidelity? That's a challenge. It's also an opportunity, but it's an area that's really hard to cut through because it's not yet clear exactly who the winners may or may not be. Another thing that we do in our suite of services is forecasting. And in a lot of the areas over the last 10 years, what we found in doing postmortem audits each of the last 10 years is we've been the most accurate forecaster versus other analyst firms across all the major game segments worldwide. The area, of course, that we're looking at here, it's much earlier on. And so what we did was a postmortem analysis in looking at how accurately we forecasted against each of the major platforms. And we generally were within 5 to 10% margin of error across all of them except for Samsung Gear VR. And the reason being, in looking back at it retroactively, was that they had some bundle programs and they had some price promotions at certain retailers that we hadn't factored into our modeling. Going forward, though, in some ways, it's going to be even harder to forecast. We're trying to understand the impact of touch controllers, of some of these more promotional bundles at lower price points, and also understanding the content aspect of, are there certain exclusives that might drive more adoption on one platform versus another. So it's a very high-risk, high-reward market. And as I was saying to Mike Fisher just now, we think we're still 2 to 3 years away from reaching mainstream critical mass, partly because the tech isn't quite there yet. So even, a lot of folks are talking about wireless VR, but there's still a huge latency issue. Even 1 millisecond of lag can lead to a lot of folks puking into barf bags. And so from a consumer standpoint, there's still some key barriers to entry and friction points that we need to alleviate and address. But the other thing is just that the pricing is not yet fully consumer friendly. And so what we've seen in Asia is a very different model that we're about to get into in showing some of those contrasts in terms of best practices. So looking at China really quickly, because I think this is an area that's undercovered in the analyst community. There are a lot of logos that you see here, and we actually work with some of these key players. And what's interesting about this model here is you do have some leading players with very big, relatively big install bases in certain cases. And what's really interesting about all of these different folks is that the distribution model in China, as this example stipulates here, entirely different from what we see in North America. In North America, it's more of an old school hardware-software dichotomy, retail plus digital and e-commerce infrastructure. And it's a direct-to-consumer model where people are buying the hardware and then they might buy software on top of that. By contrast, in Asia, where they're already monetizing, almost using more of an internet cafe model of monetizing based on time, as opposed to hardware plus content bolted onto that. So you might go to a kiosk or a theme park or a different arcade that might have a VR setup, and people might spend, let's say, $15 US for a 30-minute session of VR game time, or $5 US for a 15-minute session of some sort of virtual reality experience on a roller coaster, or going through a different part of the world and leveraging virtual tourism and things like that. So the other big difference here is major access points at the hardware level. In the West, I think right now the primary focus is on developers in consumer living rooms. And the secondary focus is on enterprise. AR might actually evolve differently, right? There are some bigger enterprise applications that we're already seeing happening with AR. And of course, it integrates more seamlessly into your day-to-day versus VR, which in some ways is a little more intrusive and a little more isolated at the moment. And hopefully over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see more innovations on the social VR side of things. In China, you're sort of working from the lowest end of the funnel first with cardboard-style headsets for the masses and all-in-one sets in the middle. And then the secondary focus is going to be on higher-end VR experiences. So one of the interesting case studies that we've already found in working with some of our Chinese clients is Survios with their game Raw Data, which was the first VR hit in terms of reaching $1 million in revenue. And one of the things that a lot of the operators of VR cafes in China are doing, companies like Omniland, is there are a lot of unlocks within the game, but what they did was they played through the whole game first to unlock all of those great items. So when consumers would go into their kiosks or their theme cafes, they got to unlock and enjoy all the different content that was available in the game. So just things like that to really reduce those frictional barriers, I think is a really important best practice. And this is another thing that some analysts run away from, but what we wanted to do was handicap the different odds of different scenarios within VR. So you have here 6 different scenarios, all the way from VR revolutionizes the way people play video games, and it really becomes an entertainment platform for the masses, to a more pessimistic point of view where it really fails to reach mainstream adoption. All of those things are still in play because 2016 was a really interesting year. It was the first big year of commercial launches for major hardware platforms. But at the same time, a lot of the major games and a lot of the major experiences are still shorter burst playtime sessions. We're still trying to figure out how online multiplayer can work on a massive scale. We're still trying to understand social VR. We're trying to understand if gaming will be the killer initial app for VR, or will there be other applications that come to the fore first, or will it be a hybrid of both? So there are a lot of different open questions. Another one is potentially, will VR pave the way for a broader mass adoption for AR and or MR? So there are a lot of open questions here, and we're tinkering with these types of models all the time because it's irresponsible for us to just say, oh, it's going to go down this one singular path. There's a lot of uncertainty in this market still, and the great opportunity here is that you guys are going to help to shape and drive what that future looks like. And you have a huge say in that because it's still a very blue ocean. The good news in gaming is that it's already a huge market. The bad news is a lot of those established markets, the oceans are so red and the competitive intensity is so high that even on mobile, which is already a $40 billion industry for gaming, for every MZ or every Supercell, there are thousands of other developers that can never cut through that clutter. And so with looking at VR, there are some opportunities here, but it's going to be really incumbent on you guys to help to shape what that future looks like. And so in our scenario analysis, we have base case, worst case, and best case scenarios. And we look at a few different competitive dimensions: technology, software, price point, platform, logistics, as well as sales and marketing. There are some other best practices and key areas of competitive differentiation as well. Retail. I think very few people understand still that to make a $400, $500, $1,000 investment in VR, whether it's getting the PC game rig along with the HMD or buying content on top of the hardware, that seeing is believing. So until someone actually gets to demo some of this new technology, it's going to be very tough to sell them on the notion that they should spend that kind of money to buy it. And so retail, ironically, is an underestimated part of that value chain. And what we saw when HTC Vive and Oculus launched was that there were some obstacles from a retail standpoint. Not that they didn't factor that in, but even just the pre-order and the inventory management processes were a little challenging from that standpoint. We're also looking at tech and user experience. There's still a lot of barriers there, not just the wireless aspect or seated versus standing, but also what are going to be the key genres and what kinds of content pieces will really drive greater adoption. And then, of course, there are always upside entrants, and we work with most of those players as well. So, Apple is obviously moving more in an AR direction, but what does that look like 2 to 3 years from now? Where we've worked with Google Niantic and we've worked with Nintendo. So with Pokemon Go, what's going to be the next big thing on the AR front with respect to smartphones or with respect to enterprise or virtual tourism or healthcare? There are a lot of different areas that are still wide open in that respect. So looking at our model for global VR, and this is just for VR, AR is still very early days. So, for example, we still don't have full edge on when Magic Leap might launch or what Microsoft is actually going to do with HoloLens in the education space versus med tech versus gaming. But when we look at VR, we have some known knowns now because some of these platforms have already launched and gone to market. So we have a pretty wide band in terms of what the revenue picture could look like, but in those prior slides, we spelled out some of the different factors and rationales that drive that. So finally, we look at the segmentation at a platform standpoint, right? PC-based versus console-based versus mobile-based. And what we find here is that they all are behaving differently from each other. So mobile, obviously, mass adoption, bigger installed base. But on the software side, the attach rates are a lot lower, and there just aren't as many compelling, engaging, immersive experiences because the tech and the form factor aren't quite as sophisticated. On the PC side, you have the other end of that spectrum where you have best-in-class games, best-in-class technology and content, but at the same time, those installed bases are still depressed because the price points are still a little bit too high. And then finally, you have smack dab in the middle, Sony. And Sony's sort of caught between a rock and a hard place because obviously, I think they've made an interesting and potentially wise move by getting into VR. The challenge for them, among other things, is that right now, VR for them is still priced around the same level as the PlayStation 4 console itself. And if you're going to be getting a PS4 this holiday, one could argue that PSVR will actually be priced higher, especially when you throw in all the other accessories that are required. And so for them, in addition to the content piece, there's the pricing disconnect. And so those are some of the barriers that we're seeing. But over time, this is going to be a really interesting market. Hopefully you guys can work with us and learn from us. And hopefully over the next few years, we can also learn a lot from you guys because a lot of what's going to happen and how we cover this space is going to be dictated by some of the moves and actions and decisions that you make along the way. So with that, I'd like to open it up for some questions.
Slide 24, you showed that
Thanks. Right.
Why?
Most of that is our assumption that hardware revenue overall will start going down because the price points are going to be going lower by 2019. So on a unit sales basis, it will still show growth, but on an overall revenue basis, because of the blended price points trending down, we're going to see a lot of that revenue going down. But on the software side, and I didn't show a slide with that, but I could put something together for you, the software piece for content creators is going to be going up as the installed base grows. But you would be surprised how much of the revenue right now is almost overinflated by these high price points. But the unit sales just aren't quite there yet. So it's going to be this interesting inflection point. We're going to see it more, hopefully, by the back half of 2018, if not sooner. But a lot of it will be dictated by what Oculus and HTC / Valve do, as well as Sony. Yeah. Yes. You know, that's a great question. I've often wondered why it hadn't already come to fruition here in the West with earlier use cases like PC MMORPGs, because there's a huge audience and fan base for those folks here in the West. But I think part of it is just that a lot of folks here already own PCs. And so, you know, and there's less of that social component than what we see in China and in Korea, where PC bongs are very, very prominent. The other irony of it is that we're also seeing internet cafes becoming more popular in other emerging markets, not even in Asia. So yes, in Southeast Asia, there are things like that, but also in LATAM. In Brazil, there's a huge presence of LAN houses that are similar to internet cafes. But here in the West, in North America specifically, a lot of gamers already own PCs because discretionary income is higher. So I don't see that taking off, but we're already starting to see some partnerships with entertainment companies who run theme parks. So Universal, Disney, they're investing in VR-themed experiences within their infrastructure of physical theme parks and resorts.
Okay, well, let's give Yoshio a big round of applause.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.